afternoon, everyone. All right, so welcome to our webcast on Maximo Scheduler. So today I'm going to be going over a couple of different things. We're going to start by outlining some of the different requirements. These are some of the foundational data pieces that you need to have in place to work with Scheduler effectively. Of course, with any Maximo application, you can use them to varying degrees of effectiveness, but this is going to be our recommended approach. After that, I'll go through the creation and features of a schedule itself. We'll talk about things like tasks, dependencies, and critical path, how we can look at different what-if scenarios. We'll also take a look at how preventative maintenance can be implemented into our schedules, as well as some of the new dashboard items that are available in Maximo Scheduler 7.5.2. So what is Maximo Scheduler? Maximo Scheduler is used to visually manage, schedule, and assign work and resources in your organization. It's an embedded graphical tool in Maximo to schedule work orders, tasks, and PM forecasts. Now, 7.5.2 does require a couple of things. If you do want to use it effectively, you do require, first of all, to have IBM Maximo version 7.5.05 to add on Maximo Scheduler 7.5.2. That is unfortunately non-negotiable. You do want to have your calendars and shifts created and applied for at least the current year so that you can look at different labors. Of course, that brings me to my next point here. You want to have your labor records associated with those calendars and shift. This allows you to plan available labor. If you're not doing that, you're really just kind of taking a shot into the dark in terms of do you have the necessary resources to accomplish these tasks at a given time. That, of course, is coupled with craft requirements defined at the work order level. And if you have all of that put together, it really becomes a very, very effective package, which we'll demonstrate for you today. So schedule creation, a couple of things to consider. What calendars and shifts are going to be used? Of course, some people just have one organization and one site. Other companies may have multiple sites and multiple crews. What you really want to think about here is what labor or resources are you authorized to schedule. You also want to think about the start date of your schedule. When do you want to start scheduling for, and when do you want to stop? Are you going to provide sort of an open window? There's a lot of different ways to dimensionalize how you view your work orders and or PMs, which of course is your next consideration. What are you scheduling this for? How do you want to apply this? So along with Scheduler comes a companion application, which we'll also be looking at today, and that is our graphical assignment. This is kind of like your assignments tab on work order tracking on steroids. It allows you to take in a Scheduler Gantt chart, same sort of view, and look at all of the various labors that will be available at the time that you want to schedule those tasks and or work orders, and allow you effectively to assign work to people through a simple drag and drop method. And we will be demonstrating that today. So in short, Scheduler allows you to plan your work when you have the necessary resources to do it. Graphical assignment allows you to hand out that work to specific individuals once you've got it scheduled at a time that you know you'll have the appropriate resources to accomplish it. All right, well, without further ado, we'll jump on over. So just to get to Maximo Scheduler, I'm just going to back up a shade. Using your go-to menu, if you select Planning and Scheduling and then Scheduler, that is going to bring you into your Scheduler application. Just like any other application, Maximo, we can create a brand new schedule by clicking our New Schedule button. And we'll give this a meaningful name. So I'm just going to call this My Schedule 010, and this will be our sample schedule for Webcast. Next, you have to decide which calendar you want to use here. This will determine what resources are available. So I've set up a number of different labor on my test system here that are associated with my company 1. And I've got a couple of different labors that are working on 2 different shifts. You can apply more than one shift here. I'm using my day and my evening shift here. So effectively, my work day is going to be from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. with 2 different shifts, which will allow me to balance some of my workload. Next, I can specify start date. This is the date you want your scheduler schedule to actually start displaying dates. I've got most of my dates set up on June 23rd, so I'm going to pick June 22nd as a start date just to make sure I can see in advance. Now we look at some of our different optional checks. Our public, just as the name implies, allows either you to keep this as a private schedule to yourself where only you can view it, or you can make it public where other individuals can view your schedule. Now, if you do make it public, there are still some limitations. Other people can go into your schedule and affect changes, but there are some limitations on who can commit schedule changes back to work orders. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Preserve existing records on refresh. By default, Scheduler does omit any closed or canceled work orders. Now, if initially your record set had included a number of different work orders that perhaps were in progress at the time, part of your project, and you still wanted to be aware of those once they were closed and canceled, you can check off this box, and this will make sure that they will still appear, mind you, in a read-only fashion in the schedule once they're canceled or closed, as opposed to being excluded such that you don't know where they went. Coming on over here, we have our preserve scheduled start dates. Now, later on in our demo, we're going to show you the critical path methodology and how we can apply that. If you have predefined targeted or scheduled start dates for a task, you can preserve those task dates by having this checked, which of course it is checked by default. By having it unchecked, that will allow the scheduler to schedule those tasks based on task dependencies and next available time slots. Refresh when opening Gantt view. Just as the name implies, this is going to go back to your work orders and or PM forecasts and get the most recent version of the data. You'll of course possibly take a little bit of a performance hit by having this checked because it does require a database refetch from those existing records. But having it checked, I always recommend that clients do this. That way you're looking at the most recent data and you won't have any surprises. If you do want to affect some what-if scenarios on your schedule, you can check off this box. And we'll show you that a little bit later on. So coming down, we've now sort of set up our header information for our schedule. I need to determine two things. Which work orders I'm going to display on my schedule. Also, what resources are going to be available to me to manage. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. First of all, we need to create a query in terms of bringing in these schedules. Now, by clicking New Row, I can create a brand new query which will bring in different work order records for this particular schedule. Now, right over here, we've got our nice little where condition. Those of you who are familiar with SQL can probably jump right in here, start typing out some different parameters and conditions, and hopefully it'll work out well for you. Others that need a little bit more help, we've got our little double chevron icon over here, where you can select either your SQL expression builder or your quick query builder. Now, the SQL expression builder you're probably pretty familiar with. This outlines all the different fields of a work order that you can apply. So let's say, for example, I wanted to use my WONUM. Here it is. And I know, for example, that in this particular schedule, I want to include work order number 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to say OK. And there you go. And then, of course, that'll transform that over here onto my where conditions. Now, if I decided that, well, you know what, I need more detail than that, but I'm really not that familiar with all of the different database field names, there is another option. Going to your double chevron, you can go to your quick query builder, which effectively leverages the functionality of the advanced search menu in work order tracking. This is a lot more user-friendly for people who are not familiar with SQLEs or don't jump into the database side of things very often. So here you can put in a couple of different things. For example, I might say that I'm looking for work orders that will apply to a particular asset, possibly to a specific location, maybe in a given status. And once I've got all of that looking pretty good. And I'm also going to limit myself to a particular target start date. And press OK. And that nicely gets transformed into what might look like gibberish to some people, but that's a nice little piece of SQL that's going to effectively bring in all the different work orders that I want to see on this work order, on this schedule. Now, for some people who are pretty familiar with Maximo but not familiar with the database size, there is a third option. You can go into your copy query, and here you can see all of the available queries that exist within the work order tracking application. So these are our saved queries. So I've set up a nice little saved query right here. This is my scheduler work order example, and I'm going to include that one as well. So now I have two queries. My Maximo schedule is going to include the work orders that are captured within both of these queries. The next thing I need to set up is what resources am I authorized to allocate. So by clicking New Row here, I'm going to create another source. Now you can do this by tool, by crew, or by labor. For my first example here, I'm going to keep it by labor. And I'll just give it a slightly descriptive name there. And in my conditions, I'm going to limit what labor I'm going to see. Now, in this particular case, I want to limit what sites I'm scheduling for and what calendars. So in my work site, I'm going to select Bedford because that's the only site I want to schedule labor for. I'm also going to limit myself to the calendar that I've already chosen, which is my Company 1 calendar. And you can, again, select more than one shift. So I'm going to select my day and my evening shift here. Press OK. This will ensure that now I'm only able to assign work to people that fall within these parameters, those labor records. So once I've got this all set up, I'll just quickly save my schedule. And let's move on over to our Gantt view. Here we go. Now when it first pops up, you might say, whoa, what is that? That looks horrible. So it does require some resizing. But the nice thing is that the scheduler will save whatever you display your layout. So let's just drag this out, move some things around, and now it's starting to look a little bit better. All right. So now scheduler here is divided into 4 quadrants. You've got your activity table, which is up in the top here. That includes a list of your work orders and a number of different columns that pertain to those work orders and those listed tasks. So here we see our work order numbers, and of course just underneath it I see my tasks. If you want to, you can collapse those work orders such that you're only viewing the work orders themselves and none of those tasks, and then expand them as you need to. Now, as you look at this, you might say, well, this isn't exactly quite what I was hoping for. Maybe I like this column over here. I want this one resized. And I'll say to myself, well, I like, for my purpose of my demo here, I want to know my status, but really all of these other pieces over here, columns, don't mean a lot to me. By going into your Select Action menu, you can go into your User Settings under Configure Gantt View Properties and choose which columns you want displayed. So for example, I'm going to get rid of my priority, asset, location, as well as my interruptible and resources. I'll click Apply and OK. Just give Maximo a second to chew on that. And there we go. So that was a lot better. So now I've got something that I can really work with, a little bit more concise. Now, over here, you see these little bars and Gantt charts which pertain to the different tasks that are within my work orders. Now, all of them right now, as you can see, are kind of on a start time. So when you look at these things, you might say, well, it doesn't look very good. I'm zoomed out way too far. You got a couple of different options in terms of availability in Maximo Scheduler. You can zoom in the old way by going in and out and shifting around using your plus minus. Your zoom to fit will basically take the very end and the very beginning and auto fit those different tasks on your window here, so you can see that a little bit more nicely. There are a couple of other options. Over here on your menu, just to the next icon over, is your zoom to week. If you want to go to a specific week and go out that way. The next is a zoom to date. So I'm going to zoom over to 23rd, because that's when I have all my stuff going on. And of course, up above here, you can put a lock or a horizontal constraint such that you're not able to scroll back and forth if you really just want to lock in what you're seeing. Now, what you're seeing right now is the targeted start times for these various tasks. As I move them around and commit this information back to my work orders, those become scheduled start times. So how do I schedule these things, and what does this all mean? Well, let's go to my first task here. This is my battery recycle, and when I look at this, I see that at this particular time, I need a lot of different resources. Now, as you drag resources around, now if you look at the bottom, you're going to see under my resources chart table, starts to move itself. This is giving me a count of all of the different crafts based on the craft requirements of my tasks that I need at a given time. Now, right now, they're all overlaid on top of each other. If you want to, you can, by looking at this particular task, you can click on your next icon, which is filter resources based on task. Now I'm only looking at electricians based on this task, and this becomes a little bit more meaningful to me. This is telling me that these orange bars represent how many electricians I need at a given point in time. This light blue shift is my day availability. This tells me during my day shift this day, I have 3 electricians scheduled to work. Just a little bit over to the right, in my evening shift, I've also got 3. So I need to do a little bit of resource allocation to balance that out. And you can see as you drag these out, that allocation starts to change. And my overload becomes a little bit more manageable. Now, if you're not a drag and drop type of person, there are other ways to manage how you move things around. By simply right-clicking on one of your tasks, you can click things like move to the next hour, if you want to move things to the next day, or move to a specific day. You can choose a day on the calendar and move it there. I'm not going to move that right now. If you need to affect the duration of your specific task, you can do that by grabbing the right or left sizing handles and dragging that out, and that will affect the actual duration of that task. If you don't like dragging and dropping, these same changes can be affected over on the side on your activity table. So for example, right now I have this task running from 10 a.m. to 11:45. If I were to change that to 10:45, you can see that that change in data is graphically represented as soon as I do that over on my Gantt chart. Now, also as we zoom in and zoom around, there's a number of other things that we can accomplish. IBM's gone to a lot of work to try and limit the amount of time you spend jumping back and forth between work order tracking and your scheduler application. They've done this via your context menu. Now you can see right here I've got a little gray arrow just next to my task. By right-clicking on that, gives me available access, to a number of what are typically select action menu commands. Your change status, initiating workflows, creating communications, in some cases viewing of item availability if you have a material requirement for a specific task, also creating a lot of other different types of related records right on the fly here without having to go all the way over to work order tracking. Now, if we're looking at the actual work order field itself, we get a couple of different options, including going to quick reporting or going to work order tracking. If for whatever reason you did need to jump on over to work order tracking, affect some changes, and then come back, you can quickly do so without having to go to menu and come out of your particular schedule. So as I look at my particular schedule here, I'm just going to zoom back in to make this a little bit more efficient. Now, I'm going to move my tasks around. We're going to get a little bit more load balancing. Remembering again, if you did want to see something like a specific electrician load, inspector load, lubricator load, you can start seeing all of those different things come into play here. I think electrician is the worst one right now. Just grab a couple more of those, balance that out. Of course, this isn't a very refined application of scheduling at this point, but right now we can see that at this point my load matches my availability. So I won't have any conflicts at that particular time. So I now know that for at least my first work order that I'm working with here, my 1234 work order, all of my tasks are set at times when I have the resources to accomplish them. So my next step, of course, is to assign these tasks to people. So before I do anything, I can save my changes in my schedule. And there we go. Now I've just saved my schedule. Now one thing I haven't done, and people say, well, okay, you just saved your schedule, and that's exactly all I've done. My work orders actually remain unaffected. Your work orders are not affected until you click the Commit Changes button. The Commit Changes button, unlike just a Save Schedule, which will save your schedule so you can continue to work on it, once you're happy with where everything's set, you can hit your Commit Changes. That is the actual pushback where it pushes all that data back into the scheduled dates of your work orders and its associated tasks. And there we go. So now we've just, those same changes here will be reflected on that particular work order. Now, as you look over here, you'll see we've just limited ourselves to the load and availability. There are some other tabs, including your scheduled costs, if you want to see how much these things are costing you. For example, right now my internal labor for this hour is $502, $295. These are, of course, rates that are captured from the craft rate table on your system. If you had some other features like some external labor, tools, or material costs, here I've got some materials on some of my tasks, so that shows up as well. You can take a look at those things. Other resource availability, if you have a schedule for your particular asset, maybe it has uptime and downtime, you can see when that particular asset will be available. If you need to group by property, that's something you can do. We don't have any capacity planning right now. In terms of additional hours and availability, you can do a little bit of work in here if you need to adjust your resources by going to crafts, or if you want to say indicate where used, you'll see there's little black highlights next to each task that indicate where my electricians are currently used. I'll show you days, hours available, evening hours available, and electrician hours needed. And as you sort of roll over those little context pop-ups will show up and let you know what you need to do. All right. So now that we've set up our little Gantt chart, we need to assign some work. This is done by way of our graphical assignment. Now, in graphical assignment application, you can assign work to your various trades. So I could go through and create a work list, which is what we call our graphical assignment objects, from scratch, but an easier way is to go to my select action and select a create work list from schedule. This leverages all the work I just did, so I can select my schedule that I just created, bring that in, and you'll notice that the work list looks very similar to your scheduled outline. A lot of the same options, a few less, but down below here we have those same work queries and resource queries. So I'm just going to save that. Now we'll move into our Gantt view. There we go. Once again, you can resize things, remembering that Maximo will remember your resizing. And if you just want to zoom to fit, we can have a look at how some of these things are represented. So this looks pretty familiar. What we're seeing here is, if you look down below, we've got our tasks up above, which is essentially what we saw when we were looking at our schedule. But what we see down in the lower resource portion is a little bit different. For example, here we see all the tasks that require electricians. Down below, we see our electrician availability. So, for example, the white space you see beside Joe Boney and Mike Pedrick here means they work on the day shift. So we can allocate time there when they are working, as well as Mike Lee. Now, Christine, Diane, and Mike Wilson, on the other hand, we have to scroll over a little bit. Their white space shows up over here because they're working on that evening shift. So as I start to allocate work, how is this accomplished? Well, it's really just a simple drag and drop. By clicking on one of my tasks, I can drag that onto Joe Boney. Whoops, a little bit of lag here. Onto Joe Boney. That task is now allocated. And once I save this, it will be assigned to Joe Boney. I'll give this one to Mike Pedrick. And I'll give this one, to Mike Lee. Now, why is that one showing up red? Well, I think it's because I'm giving it to the wrong person. So when you look down below here, you can see that this requires an electrician of a slightly different class. So if I look at this particular, it says we need an electrician, and by Mike Lee might not be the right kind of electrician. So let's see if I give it to, there we go, Mike Pedrick. That might be affected as well. And what that's really telling me is that Mike Lee, even though he is an electrician, the requirement for that particular task might be a first class or second class electrician. There we go, electrician first class, which Mike Lee is not, but Mike Pedrick is. So if you did want to keep that task on Mike Lee, you could and override the system recommendation, but it will stay red, letting you know that based on your planning, this individual is not qualified to do these things. So, of course, as we continue to drag and drop our different tasks, we fill up their schedules. This one just needs an electrician, so this one I can give to Mr. Mike Lee. And there you go. So as you go through this, you'll see that each of your crafts, here I have an electrician requirement. Down below, I have my inspector requirement, and my lubricator. And their tasks show up, of course, and there's my mechanics at the very bottom. And all of these tasks show up ready to be assigned to those different people. Of course, why am I seeing these names? Because these people have their calendars and shifts populated and associated with their labor record. So that way I can see what time they are available at and when I can give work to them. Now, let's say, for example, we were running a little short and you needed somebody like Joe Boney to come in a little bit early. Again, you have some context help here where you can go to your labor record, modify a person's availability, indicate where he's used. The modify availability is really handy. Let's look for that pop up here. If I go to the 23rd here, and I'm going to put in a new row, I'm going to say on the 23rd, he's actually going to come in a bit early. We'll say he's going to come in at 6:30. That's not early enough. I'm going to go 5:30. And he's still going to work till 3. You can say why. We'll say he's going to do some extra work. And press OK. There we go. So now we see beside Joe Boney, we've got this extra gap of white space where we've increased his availability. Similarly, if somebody were to call in sick, you can modify their availability for vacation or sick time, which would block out that time and not allow you to assign tasks to them at that particular point. And that's essentially how that goes. So the next thing I want to show you is some of our critical path methodology. So I'm going to leave my schedule here. Go back to my planning schedule. And here I already have a schedule set up for you to show you a little bit of differences. So we've got a duplicate of the same work order that's going to show up here. On one, I've created task dependencies at the work order level. On the other, I have not done anything. So in my first example, which is the work order 1243, we can see that all of my tasks showed up in the proper order based on the proper time, based on dependencies that I had set up in work order tracking at the task level. Now, if I had failed to do that, I could also do that here in work order in scheduler. Now, as I look at my different shifts here, you're going to see something else. As I click on my different tasks, you're going to see these little bars, and that's one of the reasons why these tasks at the bottom here are currently in red. These dotted red lines represent your start no later than and finish no later than times on your work order, or you can specify these at the task level. For this particular work order, I've specified them at the task level, which is why they show up differently for each task that I click on. You can specify them at the work order level, in which case they'll show up here, indicating that your very first task can start no earlier than a certain time date, and your very last task can finish no later than a certain time date. So, by clicking on my dependency here, I can now create different types of dependencies. So the first one I want to do a finish to start dependency. So I'm going to start at the end of this task, and I'll click on the beginning of that task. Now, by looking at this, you can say if you want to edit a constraint, you can edit the finish to start. You can also indicate any lag time that might be required. If, for example, we needed 30 minutes to get things done in between one task and the other, or possibly some cleanup, we can press OK, and that will come into play. Also, I'm going to create from my cleat motor, I have have a relationship between that and my inspect gear. I also have one between my clean motor and my inspect, clean, and lubricate drivetrain. And I see that I've also got a dependency between my inspect, clean, lubricate, and drivetrain and my next two tasks. So I'll create those as well. And there we go. So you might say, well, it didn't accomplish a whole lot. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Once I've selected those tasks, I can now apply my critical path methodology. And there we go. Now, I did, based on my date constraints that I put in, I am a little bit ahead of where I should be, but that's okay. I can revise those with my times, and possibly I might want to adjust my schedule. One of the reasons being, of course, I put in some lag time here, which we see there's my 30 minutes of lag time, and everything else followed and took the next available time based on on what I indicated it should be. Now, if you are doing that sort of thing, all work that is no dependencies is scheduled on the start of the earliest scheduled start date. But one thing to consider, if you have the preserve scheduled start dates checkbox, if you remember that from our header information, if that is selected, then the logic will not change at the start date of the task if it's not dependent on any other tasks. So there's an example here. We can save that. And then, of course, we can commit that back to our work orders to update all our start times. All right, so I'm going to switch over to another schedule. The one thing that I talked about, but I haven't displayed yet, is the preventative maintenance. Now, in order to work with preventative maintenance record in a schedule, you are required to have an active preventative maintenance record, and you do need to have already generated a forecast. It is that forecasted information that it's going to look at. So here we see a very, very long preventative maintenance record over a given time, all the way from June to July. You can see different tasks. So what I've got above here, let me just explain this a little better. I've thrown in a work order into the mix just to mess things up a little bit. So down below here, I've got my scheduled maintenance. So these are June, July, and various weeks where my work orders will be generated. Up above, I've included a separate query to include some corrective maintenance work that might conflict with some of my preventive maintenance record, leaving me a little bit resource deprived. So I'm going to double click on my week 26. That's another thing you can do to zoom in a little bit. I'll just zoom in a bit here. Now, I see that based on my corrective maintenance, here I need a lot of different electricians. I'm going to need a lot of mechanics. I can already see that my load far exceeds my availability on that day. And of course, this job plan right here, JP1005, that is the name of the job plan that's going to be used to generate the work order at that specific time for my preventive maintenance record. And it requires one electrician. So it doesn't have a huge requirement, but on this given day, being on June 24th, I'm already overloaded because of this corrective work. So what I can do is I can look at this and I can say, well, you know what? I do have this scheduled every 3 days. Maybe for this particular day, I'm going to move this out by 1 day. So I've moved that over to the 25th to avoid that resource conflict. But now I have a little bit of a dilemma. What do I do? I've now violated my 3-day frequency. So do I keep this little exception and let the rest roll on, or do I reforecast the rest of my work orders to keep that given frequency? Well, I want to keep that frequency. So instead of having a 2-day gap right here, I need to have this particular work order occur on the 28th. And also I'm going to need to have this work order move from the 30th to the 1st, and so on and so forth. And I could go along and drag all of these, or having selected this, I can simply click my Reforecast button here. And there we go. So I'm just going to collapse this so you can see. So that still stayed on the 25th, but as we move over, we can see that my other things got moved out. Whoops. To the 30th and to the 3rd. Okay. Oh, I see why. Well, why did we move out a little ways here to the 30th? Because if you look at our time, our white lines are our available work. The gray times are non-working time. And that we entered into a conflict there because this was over a weekend, the 20th and the 29th. So the preventive maintenance record scheduled it on the next available day, which was the 30th, and then continued the frequency from that point forward. All right, and I just have one last thing to display here. In addition to tracking work orders and PM forecasts at a task-by-task or work order level, you can also use Scheduler to look at some more summarized information. Now here, I'm not going to delve right into the actual work order itself, but rather I want to show you some of these other tabs. By clicking the Calculate Cost button on this tab, you can start to look at what these things are going to cost you on a weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. I recommended to other clients that for these particular types of schedules, include a large volume of work orders, possibly everything that's falls under the purview of a project, and that way you can get some nice summary information. So you might not be using this schedule itself to actually schedule the time, but using it more for this dashboard functionality. Looking at your resource load and functionality, you can see that how much your planned duration, how many planned labor hours you have, your available labor hours daily, weekly, on a monthly basis. You can look at some compliance reporting. Of course, here you can change how often you want to report your compliance. I currently have this set to every 3 days. You can set a duration, possibly from the start to finish of the project, and then, of course, set how often you want to report and see how that compliance is going and look at your compliance trend factor. How closely are your actuals mirroring your targeted or scheduled dates? And lastly, we have our dashboard, which utilizes a lot of that different information, looking at your compliance periods. We can look at our labor hours compliance, our work order compliance, actual work orders versus incomplete work orders, as well as our planned work, break-in work orders, and break-out work orders. So, of course, I don't have a large volume of information here in these particular circumstances for these tabs. The more information you have, the more rich these dashboards will become and be that much more useful to you. All right. So that effectively ends my demo. If anybody has any additional questions, you can reach me at my email, or feel free to please give me a call, and I'll be happy to help you out as much as I can. Otherwise, enjoy your day, and thank you very much.